In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can Australians trust the Prime Minister to act on the Aged Care Royal Commission when he cut $1.7 billion from aged care funding, nearly 11,000 people died while waiting for their approved home care package in the last year alone, there's chronic understaffing, malnutrition and ants in wounds in aged care facilities, there have been 685 deaths of aged care residents from COVID. How can Australians trust the Prime Minister when he takes responsibility for nothing and nobody?
The Leader of the Opposition's time has concluded. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The care of older Australians is a very important responsibility and one our government takes very seriously, Mr Speaker. That is why, soon after becoming Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, one of my first decisions was to initiate the Royal Commission into aged care, Mr Speaker. But that was one of many decisions taken by this government and prior to my coming into the role of Prime Minister. Mr Speaker, since 2013, our government has continued to deliver record investment in aged care, from $13.3 billion when we came to office to now $24.3 billion in the current year, Mr Speaker. And this funding will increase to some $27 billion by 23-24. This is on average, Mr Speaker, under the stewardship of this government, the effective financial stewardship, I should also stress, Mr Speaker, of this government. That is an extra $1.5 billion of extra support for older Australians every single year over the forward estimates, Mr Speaker. More money every year and increasing, Mr Speaker, because our government understands the fundamental challenges that we faced in the aged care sector, Mr Speaker, and we also want to know, Mr Speaker, about all the issues that still need to be addressed, which when we called the Royal Commission to aged care, Mr Speaker, we made very clear that we needed to deal with fundamental failings in the aged care sector, which have been happening not just recently, Mr Speaker, but over decades. Over decades, Mr Speaker. Over decades. And we need to address those fundamental issues as we respond to the Royal Commission. But, Mr Speaker, in addition to that, we announced an additional and have been delivering some $5.5 billion since the 2018-19 budget for additional home care packages, Mr Speaker. 83,105 additional home care packages. Mr Speaker, there are now a total of 195,597 packages that will be issued by the 30th of June of this year. And, Mr Speaker, between now and the 30th of June, the number of home care packages available to senior Australians is increasing by approximately 1,200 per week, Mr Speaker. We are absolutely determined and committed to address the serious issues in our aged care sector. But, Mr Speaker, as I announced when I announced the Royal Commission into aged care, I said it begins with a culture of respect for older Australians. And that's what we need in this country, Mr Speaker, and that is what my government is determined to deliver.
Members on my left, the member for Fairfax.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question goes to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister please update the House on recent positive developments in Queensland's bid for the 2032 Olympic and Paralympic Games, and how Australia's success in managing the COVID-19 pandemic is assisting our efforts to bring this global event back to Australia? Prime Minister, how good is Queensland?
Just before, members on both sides, the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, indeed, how good is Queensland? And no one knows that better than the member for Fairfax, my special envoy, Mr Speaker, who we sent in to be our advocate, Mr Speaker, and my representative for the 2032 bid for the Brisbane Olympics. But, Mr Speaker, there is more good news for Queensland because, Mr Speaker, there are now more jobs in Queensland, Mr Speaker, than there were before the pandemic started under the strong economic management, Mr Speaker, and support that has been provided by the Commonwealth Government, Mr Speaker. In addition to that, Mr Speaker, when there were 728,000 Queenslanders on JobKeeper when the pandemic was at its peak. By December, that number had fallen to 259,000, Mr Speaker, in December. 22,150 new apprentices supported by our wage subsidy program, Mr Speaker, to get new apprentices on the job and on the tools in Queensland. 24,000 existing apprentices, Mr Speaker, supported by our existing apprentices support program in some 13,000 businesses. 13,000 businesses, keeping some, Mr Speaker, 24,000 existing apprentices on the tools during the pandemic. 54,000 training places provided into Queensland, which have already been taken up and enrolled by 21,000, Mr Speaker. Wow. This is good news for Queensland as a result of the policies. And as the Minister for Housing will know, Mr Speaker, 19,000 home builder grants applications made in the great state of Queensland. Now that all comes on top, Mr Speaker, of the good news that we've had today. Mr Speaker, back in May of 2019, our government, during the course of that election, committed $10 million to support the proposal of the South East Queensland mayors that Queensland and indeed Brisbane should bid for the 2032 Olympics. And, Mr Speaker, soon after the election I was pleased to be in Osaka and raise the prospect of this bid with the President of the International Olympic Committee, Mr Speaker, and I was so pleased that by December of that year the Queensland Government committed to the bid, Mr Speaker. And I congratulate the Queensland Government, Mr Speaker, and I look forward to continuing to work with the Queensland Government as they now lead this process forward, and the Australian Olympic Committee. But, Mr Speaker, I make this reference, and this is very important for all Australians. The AOC, the Australian Olympic Committee, CEO Matt Carroll said this today in recognition of what this means for Australia. Australia brings certainty in uncertain times, Mr Speaker. That's what this bid means. The rest of the world has looked at Australia and they said they know how to get things done.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition on indulgence.
Yes, Mr Speaker, I certainly congratulate the work that's been done with the Queensland bid for the Olympics, the Australian Olympic Committee, the Government of Queensland, the backing of everyone in this federal parliament. The Olympics can bring jobs, can bring trade, can bring economic activity to Queensland and can showcase us to the world yet again. I congratulate particularly Premier of Queensland, Anastasia Palaszczuk. How good is she in keeping Queenslanders safe? And I look forward to working with her for a long time to come.
The Deputy Manager of Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. In light of events this week in an aged care facility, what additional steps has the Minister taken to ensure that before people are given the COVID vaccine, all clinical staff complete mandated training to ensure errors like this don't happen again?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very happy to respond. In particular, we are referring to, of course, the issues in relation to the Holy Spirit Home in Castledean, where a doctor failed to complete the training and where the doctor subsequently administered a higher than prescribed dose. A number of steps have occurred. Firstly, the Secretary of the Department has met with and spoken with both the CEO initially and also with the Chair of the company. I'm advised that the CEO is being stood aside as a consequence of the discussions, and that in particular that the company is installing new management. They are bringing in additional management. It is a company that is currently employed or has been employed through the course of the pandemic by the West Australian Government, by the Victorian Government, by the Northern Territory, by New South Wales, and has a long history of employment on that front. In addition, at the Government's request, the former Chief Nursing and Midwifery Officer of Australia, Deb Toms, has been installed to oversee clinical guidance. In addition, there has been a review of the mandated and required training, which was part of the contract of the company, which it was in breach of, and that it has been confirmed that every person involved with a clinical role in the vaccine has completed that training. That has already been done, has already been reviewed, and has already been confirmed by the department. In addition to that, what we are doing is bringing in additional clinical support in New South Wales and Queensland, and so that's been a direct response under the guidance of Professor Brendan Murphy, who has met with the company. So there was a breach, a clear breach, a breach of the required standards by the individual, a breach by the company, which not only failed to meet their contractual obligation, but also, very significantly, provided false advice, but as we can see, serious consequences, but above all else, safety procedures put in place. And I can inform the House that prior to question time at approximately 1 p.m, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer and myself spoke with the Chief Medical Officer for the Metro North District in Brisbane, Dr Liz Rushbrook, who is overseeing the clinical care of the two patients in question, the 88-year-old male, the 94-year-old female. Her advice to us is that both have been unaffected, both are in very strong health. There have been no adverse impacts, and indeed the woman will be returned at the request of her family to her facility this afternoon. The male will stay in hospital for a prepared, already predicted elective surgery procedure. So both are in good health.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is rolling out the COVID-19 vaccine in regional areas and the logistical effort involved in the distribution across Australia?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Cowper for his question. From the earth to the moon. Those members opposite are probably wondering what announcement I'm about to make. Prime Minister is probably too, for that matter, but stay tuned. Stay tuned. Listen up. The COVID-19 vaccine program began on Monday. We all know that. The rollout of the vaccine is one of the largest logistical exercises undertaken in this nation's history. There are 134 vaccination sites around Australia, and nearly 44% of those are in regional Australia. In conjunction with the states and territories, their health services, we expect there to be more than 1,000 vaccine sites across the country. The initial doses of the vaccine will be available to aged care and disability care residents and workers, frontline healthcare workers, quarantine and border workers. The people eligible for the first round of vaccines who live in regional Australia will not be disadvantaged by their postcode, and nor should they be. Everyone who gets the vaccine will be able to get it close to where they live. Now, in the member for Cowper's electorate, the Garden Village nursing home residents and workers in Port Macquarie will begin receiving their vaccine in week 1. The CEO of Garden Village, Craig Wern, said residents who call Garden Village home are looking forward to the Pfizer vaccine being rolled out at the facility from Saturday. 100-year-old resident Grace Simons describing her decision to have the vaccine. She said it's a way of helping to fight back. Good on you, Grace. The government is also working with both DHL and Linfox to ensure cold chain storage and supply to all Australians, including rural and remote locations. Saul Resnick. Now, I've mentioned him before. He is the CEO of DHL Supply Chain. He said they have completed, I know you're all waiting for this, I know you're all waiting with bated breath. Listen up, 341 delivery consignments of vaccines so far, and the vaccines have travelled 397,782 kilometres around Australia to get to their destinations. That is further than from the moon to the earth. 3 cheers for that. These deliveries by road and by air freight have delivered 49,655 doses of vaccine intact and within specification. Well done to DHL, well done to those frontline medical personnel, and I say well done to our truckies. They have done a magnificent job right throughout COVID to get the deliveries, whether it's now the vaccine, whether it's those supplies to supermarkets, whether it's face masks, respiratory devices. They've done it. I say, on behalf of the parliament, thank you, well done, truckies.
The member for Bendigo.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Health Minister. COVID vaccinations at the Benatas nursing home in Kangaroo Flat were meant to begin yesterday. A constituent told me that he was there with his grandmother, who gets really anxious about needles. 49 residents and their families were waiting. The facility put on extra staff, but the Commonwealth's private contractor never showed up. How did this happen? And can the minister assure the House that this mismanagement is not widespread?
The Minister for Health. Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very happy to...
Members on my left, the Minister has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I'm very happy to receive any details in relation to that specific case. I can inform the House this, that as of last evening, we have seen 71 aged care facilities across Australia receive vaccination, and I should add that Holy Spirit in Castle Dean has continued the program, and that in particular that they are expecting a 96% take-up rate amongst their residents. This is the facility which in particular we referred to before. In Victoria, 17 facilities and 1,181 aged care residents have been provided with vaccination. These are confirmed in advance with the facilities. If you could provide the details to me, I'd be happy to follow, that up, and we will make inquiries about that particular facility. But very interestingly, what we have seen is that the number of facilities have continued to increase. First day was a trial day with approximately 6. Then we've gone to over 20. Now we've collectively gone to over 71. Today we're expecting well over 20 facilities, well over 1,600 individuals to be vaccinated, and that's occurring around the country. That's what's actually occurring. The order of particular facilities, sometimes on the basis of the advice of the facility, sometimes on the basis to readjust one facility due to another, will differ. But let us be absolutely clear. Let us be absolutely clear that we are seeing these facilities being rolled out around the country. As of last evening, the advice from the department, 71 facilities across the country in the first 3 days, better than I had originally expected over the course of that time, knowing that we were starting and building up and up and up. In addition to that, those other measures that we mentioned with regards to additional workforce being put on in New South Wales and Queensland. And so, indeed, under the Commonwealth contracts, Victoria has had the highest number of facilities and the highest number of aged care residents of any state and territory vaccinated so far.
The member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In Germany, farmers own 10% of all renewable energy, and everyday people own another 30%. If we had a similar system here, billions of dollars could flow into the pockets of regional Australians. My proposed Australian Local Power Agency, which you and I discussed last week, would achieve this by requiring new large renewable energy projects to offer residents within 30 kilometres the chance to invest in those projects. Does the Prime Minister believe that regional Australians should have a legislated right to invest in renewable energy projects being built in their communities?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Yeah, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Indi for a question, but I also thank her for engagement on this issue, not just this year, but the meetings we've had last year as well. And she knows my keen interest in the path that she's pursuing here, Mr Speaker, and the tangible benefits that can be achieved for local communities, whether they be particularly in regional communities, and what that can mean for industry in regional communities, not just householders, Mr Speaker, and especially when it comes to investment in renewable energy. Our government is considering the proposal as I've said, in good faith, and we will continue to work through that detail. I note the matter that the member has brought before this House to that end. And we're also considering the government support for community-driven renewable energy projects. Part of our plan includes our $50.4 million Regional and Remote Communities Reliability Fund, backing microgrid feasibility studies across Australia to help unlock investment that would better meet the local electricity supply. And I know the member for Leichhardt, Mr Speaker, is also very interested in those proposals and many other around the country. So I can say to the member for Indi, this is exactly the type of thing that we want to see realised. Our plan is working. We have now seen in a record 8 consecutive quarters now of year-on-year CPI price reductions in energy, and we want to see that realised in regional Australia as much as we want to see it in our metropolitan areas. And I'll ask the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction to respond further, Mr Speaker.
The Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I'm pleased to add to the Prime Minister's answer. And I've met with the member for Indi on her proposal, and now we have the legislation as of this week. We're working our way through that, but we are delivering on a plan for a range of initiatives across regional Australia to support reliable, affordable energy as we bring down our emissions. The Prime Minister's already mentioned the microgrid program, projects like in the Daintree, the member for Leichhardt's electorate, but also the member for Indi's electorate, where there's a project looking at pump hydro and batteries to support the record levels of investment we're seeing in solar, Mr Speaker. We're also supporting community organisations, small businesses and dairy farmers through the $40 million Energy Efficient Communities program. And in the member for Indi's electorate, that has included the Yakandanda Football and Netball Club and the Benalla Aviation Museum. Mr Speaker, these grants are providing community groups and businesses with the opportunity to make investments to deliver affordable, reliable energy as we bring down our emissions. That's our commitment. That's what we're delivering. Thank you again for the discussions we've had in recent times.
The member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer inform the House how the Morrison government's success on both the health and economic fronts has ensured Australia is as well positioned as any country in the world to recover strongly from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Treasurer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I acknowledge the member for Wentworth's hard work in small business but supporting Australian technology companies getting access to international markets and his outstanding work in diplomacy, Mr Speaker, as an ambassador representing our nation. Now, Mr Speaker, the Australian economy is performing better than nearly any other economy around the world, and on the health front, Australia is responding and dealing with this virus as well as any other country in the world. And I can inform the House that today the Australian economy got another shot in the arm, Mr Speaker, because capital expenditure is up 3% in the December quarter, the single largest increase in capital expenditure since March 2012, Mr Speaker, since March 2012. And the ABS saying that businesses have upgraded their investment intentions off the back of our instant asset write-off. And in last year's budget, we announced the most significant investment incentives ever in this country, supporting around $200 billion of investment with the immediate expensing provision and the loss carryback measures, which Treasury said will help create around 50,000 jobs, Mr Speaker. Now, this is the latest proof point in an economic recovery that is well underway here in Australia. We've seen the unemployment rate fall to 6.4%. We've seen business and consumer confidence recover to its pre-pandemic levels. We've seen Australia's AAA credit rating being reaffirmed. We've seen around 94% of the 1.3 million Australians who either lost their jobs or saw their working hours reduced to zero at the start of this pandemic now back at work, Mr Speaker. And the Morrison government will continue to provide the economic support that this country needs right to the end of this pandemic, Mr Speaker, including the JobMaker hiring credit, including the tax cuts, including those investment incentives, in bringing forward infrastructure spending, as well as pursuing historic world-leading economic reforms like our changes to the digital platforms with our mandatory media code, which passed the parliament today, Mr Speaker, which passed the parliament today and which will help create jobs and which will help sustain public interest journalism in this country. So, Mr Speaker, our focus, our number one focus is on creating jobs, and Australia's performance, the performance of 25 million Australians, has seen us better placed than nearly any other country in the world on both the health and the economic front.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Mr Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Today I met Hungry Panda delivery rider Jun Young, who says that he worked 12-hour days, earning as little as $12.50 an hour, way below the minimum wage. Mr Young says his employment was terminated when he spoke out. This is the same company that has seen deaths, of course, at the end of last year. Why is it so complicated to pay people like Mr Young no less than the minimum wage?
Just before I call the Minister, I just remind all members, the Leader of the Opposition, that names should only really be in questions when they're absolutely necessary to validate the question. The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for the question. I also met with Mr Young, and his story is not a happy one, far from it. And Hungry Panda, their conduct has been very, very bad as a business. I absolutely agree. And in fact, very recently they were before a committee of inquiry in New South Wales where it was noted that they failed to notify the appropriate authorities of a workplace death. And of course, all of these platforms operating as businesses in Australia are absolutely subject to Australian work health and safety laws administered by the states, of which system the Commonwealth is a part. So I might just commence this answer by noting that that sort of behaviour from that company is absolutely unacceptable. And the fact that it is being pursued in New South Wales as it should be, that needs to be brought to bear. That is a complete breach of Australian law and health and safety laws. What I was, and listening to Mr Young's experiences, you could not have anything but a great deal of sympathy. What I was unwilling to say to Mr Young and to the Michael Caine from the Transport Workers Union is that improving that situation is somehow simple or easy or uncomplicated, because with due respect to the Leader of the Opposition and to the Shadow Minister of Industrial Relations, it's just not. And I think that some parallels are borne out, as the Leader of the Opposition noted today, between what happened with the media code this week. And we are not cheerleading for gig economy platforms. Far from it. They should obey Australian law. And the Fair Work Commission has noted in a range of decisions that it is not an employment relationship, but nevertheless occupational health and safety laws apply. But the idea that you can simply move that group of people who work inside that part of the digital economy from what has been consistently appraised by the Fair Work Commission to be a contracting arrangement into employment-type arrangements with employment-type minimum remuneration fixed, and that you can do that simply, is just not correct. And for anyone who believes that this is uncomplicated and that there are not complications, they could just listen to the Shadow Minister's transcript from today on Sky News. And there's not a criticism of the Shadow Minister. He raised the issues about why this is complicated. The cost to the business of changing the model, the loss of flexibility to the employees, the fact that there would be invariably a large impact on consumer pricing. Now, the process that we went through with the media code went back several years to an ACCC inquiry to fully understand how that market worked, because what we did not want to see is the withdrawal of those businesses from Australia. We wanted to see those businesses in both competition and safety work fairly.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's rollout of safe, effective and free vaccines is underpinning our health and economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Boothby, not only for her question but also for her cross-party work on the Stillbirth National Action Plan, in particular with Senator Billick, to whom we extend our best wishes and the thoughts of all in this House. We know that obviously the pandemic continues abroad. 11,000 lives lost in the last 24 hours, 0 at home here in Australia. Another day of 0 cases of community transmission Australia-wide. That is an extraordinary outcome. 28 days this year so far of 0 community transmission at a time when, again, in the last 24 hours, over 430,000 cases. So the pandemic rages across the world. Within Australia, we remain in an island sanctuary thanks to the work of all Australians across the nation. The international border controls and the declaration today by the Commonwealth Chief Medical Officer of a hotspot in regards to Auckland is another part of that. The work in terms of testing, again almost 50,000 tests in the last 24 hours, of tracing, which continues to strengthen, continuous work in strengthening around the country, and distancing and the way in which even this parliament on this day continues to practice and show a national example of that continued engagement. But then, of course, the work with regards to containment. And we're seeing very heartening results on the safety and effectiveness of vaccines from around the world. Public Health Scotland has been able to indicate very high levels of protection against serious illness, against hospitalisation and loss of life from both the vaccines that they've been putting in place, both Pfizer and AstraZeneca. The AstraZeneca results, in fact, Prime Minister, are slightly stronger than for the Pfizer vaccine, and I think that's an important message to some in Australia who have taken a contrary view to that which has been put out by the Australian Academy of Science, the World Health Organisation or the Lancet Journal, which have underlined that importance. At the same time, during the course of this week, the rollout has commenced, and we have gone from just over 1,600 doses on the first day to approximately just over 6,000 doses on the second day to almost 10,000 doses on the third day. By midday tomorrow, we'll have today's figures, and what we are seeing is that they are increasing each and every day. Each and every day, more and more people. And what we're seeing is Australian health professionals do an extraordinary job, and we want to thank them for their work. We want to thank all of those who are involved, and to say to Australians, whilst we are doing well, the next phase has commenced, and that will provide safety and protection for us.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Can the Minister confirm that on the 12th of February his office passed official information about the reported alleged sexual assault of Brittany Higgins to the office of the Prime Minister? Who in the Prime Minister's office received that official information? At what time was the official information received?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Mr Speaker, as I advised the House yesterday and mentioned in media today, I received a briefing from the AFP Commissioner on the 11th. I took a decision, I think a right decision at that time, not to advise the Prime Minister, because whilst the briefing from the AFP Commissioner was at a high level as to process and not detail, nonetheless it was provided to me in my role as the Minister in charge of the Australian Federal Police. There were media inquiries to the government on the 12th, and my office, as a courtesy, on my advice to my Chief of Staff, contacted the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff. There was no operational detail provided. There were no official, or the wording that you used. There was simply a passing of acknowledgement that the AFP had an interest in this matter, and obviously the sensitive investigation unit had made a determination on the 11th, as is the case of normal practice within the AFP, when Brittany had approached the AFP on the 5th of February, and they had made a determination at that point on the morning of the 11th that this was a sensitive investigation, and on that basis as the honourable member would be aware, under the guidelines of the Australian Federal Police, there is then an obligation on the Police Commissioner to advise me, which is what happened in due course.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Minister for Government Services. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is ensuring the NDIS is supporting the vaccine rollout for Australians living with a disability?
The Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Minister for Government Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for her question and acknowledge her hard work and, importantly, her great compassion for the over 1,600 participants in the electorate of Higgins. She sets a marvellous example. The recent NDIS quarterly data demonstrates that we've continued to deliver critical NDIS supports during 2020, which was an extraordinarily difficult year for Australians. Indeed, there are now 430,000 participants in the scheme, and last year, 2020, 93,500 participants were added during that year. 250 participants per day during an extraordinarily difficult year. Importantly, 100% of all access decisions were made within 21 days, and over the last 18 months, the average time it takes for children to enter the scheme has dropped from 42 days to just 3 days. The Morrison government is ensuring the scheme is delivering a consistent and high-quality experience to many vulnerable Australians. And as a result of COVID-19, the government's continued to implement a range of temporary measures to support participants and providers, whilst continuing to make the scheme simpler, fairer and more consistent. Particularly, there's a strategy to ensure equitable access to people with disability for vaccines. The first program or area of vaccination prioritises Australians with disability in residential care settings in recognition of the higher risk that they face. Frontline healthcare workers and staff will also be vaccinated. And the government will also ensure that those with underlying medical conditions and complex health needs are some of the first to receive the vaccination. Indeed, 840 NDIS participants are expected to be offered the vaccine this week across over 200 aged care and disability accommodation sites. By the end of March, the government aims to have at least 4 million doses of the vaccine administered and then an accelerated rollout, as the Minister for Health has talked through. And as we progress during the year, the government will continue to ensure that participants will have access to any temporary measures that are needed where COVID hotspots are declared. And despite the impacts of the pandemic and all the work that's being done, we'll continue to support participants as we have done. In Australia, and of course our national life, there's been about 108 cases per 100,000 in the general population diagnosed with COVID. By comparison, it's only 43.4 cases per 100,000 with NDIS participants. That is less than half of the national rate, which is testament to the work of the disability sector, the agency and all levels of Australian government.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. How can it be that after, according to the Minister for Home Affairs, he was briefed by the AFP on the 11th of February, and then information provided by the Office of the Minister for Home Affairs to the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister the next day about a reported sexual assault just metres from where the Prime Minister works was not conveyed to the Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has the call. Members on my left. The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, the matter just raised by the Leader of the Opposition has been on the public record since Monday of last week. I've been very clear, Mr Speaker,
on my left,
that I learned of these matters on the 15th of February and that my office, I'm advised, knew of these matters on the 12th of February, Mr Speaker, which is exactly what the Minister for Home Affairs just said. Mr Speaker, I learned of it on the Monday. My office learned of it, I'm advised, on the Friday, Mr Speaker. The Minister for Home Affairs advised my office through his Chief of Staff to mine on the Friday, Mr Speaker. Now, Mr Speaker, what is relevant here, Mr Speaker? Mr Speaker, what is relevant here is what should members, senators, leaders of the opposition, prime ministers, ministers, shadow ministers, whoever, Mr Speaker, what should be done in the case of one of our members of staff, or indeed a member of Senate or a colleague, what should be done if we are aware, Mr Speaker, or they wish to make a complaint in relation to an alleged sexual assault, as the Commissioner of the Federal Police has advised all of us. What should be done, Mr Speaker, is in respecting the person who is at the centre of this, we should be advising and passing this information on to the police. That is what we've been advised to do. That is the process. That is the process the Minister for Defence Industry followed at the time, Mr Speaker. And had I been in a position of knowing about this earlier, Mr Speaker, I would have done two things. I would have inquired, Mr Speaker,
members on my left,
about the welfare of Brittany Higgins, Mr Speaker, at that time and what support had been provided to her. And I would have inquired as whether the matter had been raised with the police. On both of those cases, Mr Speaker, as we have learned in the answers that have been provided,
the Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The Prime Minister now talking about hypotheticals. This is a real circumstance. This happened. The Prime Minister's Chief of Staff was told by the Minister's Chief of Staff on the Friday, and the question goes to, why didn't your Chief of Staff tell you? How is it possible that it waited till Monday?
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Members will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister has certainly addressed the question at the beginning of his answer. He's now providing some context that I don't think is at odds with the relevance of the question. I'm listening to the Prime Minister. He's in order.
As I was observing, they are the steps that any member, had it been advised to them or to me, Mr Speaker, on that Friday or later or at any other time, Mr Speaker, they are the inquiries that you would have made. Now, it is the case that in both cases that the action of the Minister at the time had sought to put support around Brittany Higgins, Mr Speaker, as they did, and as we have apologised and accepted over time, Mr Speaker, it is very clear that Brittany did not feel that she had that support. That is understood, and that is the subject of the multi-party inquiry we are now engaged in. But it is the case, Mr Speaker, that this matter was advised to the police, that the police did follow through on these matters, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I've been very clear when my office advises me they knew about this matter and when I knew about it. I was not pleased that I was not advised at the time on the Friday.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question is to the Minister for Indigenous Australians. Will the Minister please update the House on the work the Morrison government is undertaking to ensure access to the COVID-19 vaccine for Indigenous communities?
The Minister for Indigenous Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I also want to thank the member for Robinson for her continued interest in this area, but the work that you've done as a family in remote communities in the Northern Territory and the work you continue to do in New South Wales. To date, Australia's been lucky with the COVID-19. What we anticipated as a major issue for Indigenous communities has not had that impact. And I want to thank the officers of the Commonwealth Department of Health and the National Indigenous Australian Agency for the way in which they've worked together with both myself and my colleague, the Minister for Health. The Minister established an Indigenous advisory body to provide examples and directions of the activity that needs to be taken to ensure that Indigenous Australians have access to the vaccines, but more importantly to information and the support services that will prevail in the rollout of the vaccine. It is jointly chaired by the Department of Health, so it is a co-design model of where the chair of NACCHO, Pat Turner, and the officer from the Department of Health have worked together. That has the endorsement of the Communicable Diseases Network and the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee. And what they're doing is they are rolling out culturally safe, comprehensive approaches to ensuring that any Indigenous Australians from homeland communities through to rural and remote communities have access to the treatments and the vaccines. And all Indigenous Australians will have the opportunity of accessing the vaccine program. But Indigenous Australians aged over 55 will be part of Phase 1B, which means that we start the process of ensuring that our people are protected against COVID-19. And that rollout will require a comprehensive approach from the community-controlled health sector, who provide an invaluable service on the ground, but that'll be done in partnership with GPs, clinics that are established in particular locations, and that the vaccine access will mean that we will see families enrol and have the vaccine. And their record of the vaccine will be kept as part of that process. But right at the beginning, we were proactive. We can use the Biosecurity Act to protect Indigenous communities across this nation. And my colleague, in all the work that he has done, has worked closely with me. And our considerations are to ensure that there is not the level of impact that we thought would happen. And that result has manifested in what we see in the very low figures within our community. So I want to thank everybody who's involved. It's a great outcome, and it means that we will have better opportunities in the future in the way in which we collaborate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Leader of the House. Sorry, the Leader of the Opposition. I shocked the Leader of the House.
Had that gig for 6 years, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister, and I refer to his previous answer where he suggested that it had been known for some time, the involvement of the Minister for Home Affairs and his office. Why is it that, in fact, almost 2 weeks after the media broke the story of a reported sexual assault in Parliament House in March 2019, Brittany Higgins, the Parliament and the people are still learning details of the government's response? Why isn't the Prime Minister just being straight, and why does the story keep changing?
The Prime Minister has the call.
The assertions put forward by the Leader of the Opposition are simply incorrect. Now, Mr. Speaker, he can assert these things all he likes, Mr. Speaker, but that does not make them true. Mr. Speaker, we have been very plain and clear. Mr. Speaker,
members on both sides.
I learned about it on the Monday. My office, I'm advised, learned about it on the previous Friday. Mr. Speaker, now, I should have been told when my office knew on the Friday. I learnt of it on the Monday. I've been very clear about that, Mr. Speaker. I could not be more clear about that, Mr. Speaker. The suggestion put forward by the Leader of the Opposition that somehow the Minister for Home Affairs had known about this for some time, Mr. Speaker, is not the case. That's simply not true, Mr. Speaker. He learned about it on the Thursday. His office advised mine about it on the Friday, Mr. Speaker, at about the same time, Mr. Speaker, when the media had reported on these issues. And, Mr. Speaker, I was advised of it on the Monday. That is the clear facts that I've represented to this House each and every day. All I can conclude from this, Mr. Speaker, is Labor may try as they might to score political points over such a serious
members
issue.
on both sides.
Mr. Speaker, my government will continue to focus on the issue here, which is the safety of people who work in our buildings. And what should be done, Mr. Speaker, in the event that if any one of our staff, if indeed any member or senator, Mr. Speaker, may be in a situation where they may be in a receipt of an allegation or seek to make a complaint themselves, that members and senators know exactly what they should do in those circumstances. Now, that is why I wrote to the presiding officers, Mr. Speaker, and advised them of the advice I'd received from the Commissioner of the Federal Police. I hope that is of some assistance to members and senators if they're put in this situation. It's very clear, Mr. Speaker, that what we should seek to do is both in supporting the person who'd be the subject of any possible complaint, that we should seek to ensure that these matters are brought to the attention of the police, Mr. Speaker, which is what the Minister for Industry at the time did, Mr. Speaker. This was a matter that was known to the police and had been looked at by the police, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very pleased that Brittany Higgins has re-engaged with that process with the police, and I look forward to how that investigation proceeds.
The member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I'm very pleased to be able to ask the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology to outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting businesses in growing our science and space sector as part of our plan to build a stronger Australia and create jobs in our local Aussie businesses, particularly as we recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic.
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. And how good is space? I am sure that there are so many people in this chamber, so many members, who would have watched NASA's Perseverance rover touch down on Mars just last week. And I'm sure that my co-chair of Parliamentary Friends of Science, the member for Corio, would have been watching all of that footage when that rover touched down into its forever home on Mars. But, Mr Speaker, while space inspires us and space excites us, it actually does so much for us each and every day. It has enormous benefits for us in our everyday lives. It helps our emergency workers tackle bushfires. It helps our farmers manage their crops. Every day when we use the likes of Google Maps, it helps direct us to where we need to be. It drives the changes that we need in automation, the changes that we need in robotics. It's helping us with engineering. So much of the space sector has flow-on benefits for our industries. Now, we have recently appointed a new head of the Australian Space Agency, Enrico Palermo. Now, he came to us from Virgin Galactic, so he actually has built spaceships. Now, he is going to take the Space Agency on the next step of their development, which is to look at how we can create commercial opportunities for our businesses here, because we as a government understand how important space is, not just to our everyday lives, not just because of the inspiration it gives to our young people to study science and maths and school, but what it can do to grow our economy here. Now, we have an enormous opportunity to be part of the global space race, to look at how we can develop that as a key manufacturing sector here in Australia. That's why we named space as one of our key manufacturing national priorities. And we have already opened the funding for the space sector under our Modern Manufacturing Initiative. And I've spoken previously, Mr Speaker, about the fact that we have right here in Canberra a fantastic business, Skycraft, that is in the process of manufacturing over 200 small satellites. But they're not the only space business that we have. We have Black Sky Aerospace, who recently successfully launched a rocket using Australian-made solid-state rocket fuel. That was the first ever successful launch of that in Australia. We have Gilmore Technologies, who are already getting great successes. Space is great.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Minister for Home Affairs has described the alleged sexual assault of Brittany Higgins as a matter of he said, she said. Shame. Does the Prime Minister agree with this description?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Speaker, this is a matter that is now, as we know, being further investigated by the Federal Police. And what is very important with such serious matters, Mr Speaker, is that we allow the police to do their job. They, Mr Speaker, are the ultimate arbiters about how investigations into such sensitive matters are undertaken, the consideration and the weighing of evidence in that process, and ultimately working with the DPP in the event of bringing forward a public prosecution, Mr Speaker. I make this point because, Mr Speaker, when it comes to the protection of all Australians on any matter, Mr Speaker, on any matter at all, we all rely on the operation of our criminal justice system and the work of our brave law enforcement authorities, and I've got to say highly expert and sensitive law enforcement authorities. And I want to particularly commend those women and men who work in the sensitive area, Mr Speaker, of dealing with victims of sexual assault, Mr Speaker. So, in answer to the question, Mr Speaker, the ultimate view about these matters, Mr Speaker, is how the police interrogate and investigate that evidence, form a view, Mr Speaker, and allow a brief of evidence to be prepared. That is the process in this country, and we should stand by the rule of law and its administration in this country on every occasion.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment. How was the Morrison government's comprehensive approach and matching investment in climate adaptation working towards the creation of a more resilient and prosperous Australia?
The Minister for the Environment.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for his question, note his support for community environment projects in the electorate of Goldstein. We occupy the driest inhabited continent on Earth, and we've always managed our landscapes in the face of a changing climate. Australians understand better than most the importance of adapting to harsh climatic conditions, not just to avoid loss through events like natural disasters, but also to unlock opportunities. Now, our environmental scientists are world-leading. For example, researchers at the University of Southern Queensland are working to understand which variant of coffee bean will best suit changes in climate, an issue I know is of deep importance to the member's constituents in the Bayside suburbs of Melbourne. It's just one example, Mr Speaker, of planting the right crop in the right place for the right conditions. Your enterprise becomes more productive. Rural and regional Australians on this side of the House instinctively know that. In Antarctica, the science Australia is leading is extraordinary. Major research on sustainable krill populations, which are vital to the carbon cycle. And our scientists are putting together the world's climate in context with the million-year ice core, analysing and recovering that information. In Queensland, our marine scientists are seeding reefs with heat-resistant corals to help them adapt to warming oceans. Our world-leading coral restoration program is crucial to reef-based economies and the work that depends on it. For example, the Great Barrier Reef employs 64,000 people, and I know the special envoy for the reef is fighting for each and every one of those jobs. In the West, our National Environmental Science Program is working with Indigenous rangers to combine science and traditional knowledge to restore the seagrass beds of the World Heritage-listed Shark Bay. Healthy estuaries mean healthy breeding grounds for marine life, which in turn mean more productive fisheries. Now, these ground-level examples demonstrate part of Australia's $15 billion ongoing commitment to building resilience to a changing climate. Mr Speaker, climate adaptation is caring for our country through practical actions like our National Soil Strategy. The strategy means that more organic matter, rich in carbon, in our topsoils, make our farms more productive and support more biodiversity in our landscape. The Morrison government is acutely aware not just of the challenges posed from a changing climate, but the opportunities.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. And I ask, why did the Prime Minister publicly rebuke the Minister for Defence for not telling him about the reported sexual assault of Brittany Higgins in 2019, but has not rebuked the Minister for Home Affairs for exactly the same thing?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do very much welcome this, Mr Speaker, because I've only been asked one question in relation to that issue which you've just raised. I was asked, I remember it was after we had just been together, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition and I, in relation to the ovarian cancer breakfast. And I was asked by journalists about whether I was unhappy that I hadn't been told about this matter, Mr Speaker. And I've been asked the same thing here. Mr Speaker, my response in relation to not being happy about this, Mr Speaker, related to the fact that I did not know about this on Monday. I made no reference to Minister Reynolds, Mr Speaker. I made no reference, Mr Speaker, to Minister Reynolds, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I would have hoped, Mr Speaker, in relation to Minister Reynolds, that on these matters, that some anonymised some anonymised, Mr Speaker, reference to this could have been brought to my attention. And if she had done that, Mr Speaker, I would have done exactly as I indicated to the House right here, Mr Speaker. Now, in relation to the Minister for Home Affairs, the Minister for Home Affairs advised my office from his Chief of Staff to mine. He took that step, Mr Speaker. He did that to my office and I was appraised. In relation to the then Minister for Defence Industry, that minister, Mr Speaker, did not disclose that in an anonymised way. That is something, Mr Speaker, that I wish she had, but she did not. And her reasons for doing that was to protect Brittany Higgins' privacy. She has said that, Mr Speaker, and I've reflected on that. People may form different views about whether that was a wise decision. Now, I've done the same thing, Mr Speaker. I've done the same thing, and as a result, I would hope that in the future, that if people wish to protect the privacy of any individual, that they could raise these matters in an anonymised way. Indeed, the Minister for Home Affairs, as I understand it, was not aware of the identity of Brittany Higgins in that matter, Mr Speaker. But the Minister for Home Affairs did raise it with my office through his Chief of Staff to my Chief of Staff the following day.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's Job Ready Graduates package is providing an additional 30,000 university places for Australian students and encouraging take-up in courses that are more likely to get them into a job during our COVID-19 recovery?
The Minister for Education
can I thank
and
the
Youth.
member for Lindsay for her question and for her outstanding advocacy for Western Sydney, and in particular the University of Western Sydney, which she is a very strong supporter of. And I can confirm, Mr Speaker, that the Job Ready package is working as intended to deliver more people into courses which have a greater chance of them getting a job at the other end. And, Mr Speaker, you might recall that this package was put together last year during the pandemic, and it was designed to provide more opportunities for young people to upskill and to do degrees which will get them into work. There was a number of components to this package. First up, there was an additional 30,000 places for young people next year, 100,000 over the course of the decade. That means 100,000 more opportunities for young people to get a government-subsidised place at university, Mr Speaker, and I can confirm that this year applications are up 7% already, which is a great result. But the second point about this package, it was very carefully constructed
for Sydney
to drop the prices to students of courses which had the best job outcomes. So, for example, that might include agriculture, nursing, teaching, IT, some of those types of courses which we have dropped the fees for as a way of encouraging people to go into those courses. And I can confirm to the member for Lindsay and to this House there that, again, the preliminary data shows that this is also having the desired impact. So, for example, in agriculture, and we know the opportunities which there are in the agricultural sector, we dropped the fees to students by 59%. We have seen, in part because of this, applications go up 16% already. So a great outcome as a result of that. And the Australian Council of Deans of Agriculture, they've actually said that without exception, numbers have gone up across the board of all of those agricultural courses, between 5%, in some cases over 50%. In health courses, which includes nursing, we reduced the cost of students by 18%. We've seen a 15% increase in applications. Again, another great outcome. In education, prices are down 42%, and we have seen applications go up 10%. In IT, prices down 18% to students, applications are up 7%. These are great outcomes. Of course, students make up their own minds which courses they do, but they are applying to those courses which have the best chance of getting a job, and that's what this package was intended to do.
Concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Isn't it beyond belief the Prime Minister didn't know about the reported sexual assault of Brittany Higgins when one member of his staff knew 2 years ago, a second said it would be raised with the Chief of Staff 2 years ago, a third knew the alleged perpetrator had been dismissed 2 years ago, a fourth checked in with Ms Higgins last year, his office was dealing with media inquiries, and the Office of the Home Affairs Minister told the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I have consistently said in this place over the past 2 weeks, I'm advised my office knew on Friday the 12th of February, and I have answered honestly that I first knew of the sexual assault allegations, Mr Speaker, on Monday the 15th of February. I could not have been clearer about that matter.
The member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reductions. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's focus and commitment to affordable and reliable energy is supporting families and businesses as we chart our way out of the COVID-19 recession?
The Minister for Energy and Emissions.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moncrieff for her question. And I acknowledge the many years she spent helping small businesses in her region and elsewhere to grow and to employ people, Mr Speaker. She knows a lot about doing that, and she knows that affordable, reliable energy is absolutely essential for those small businesses, the 30,000 small businesses across the Gold Coast that rely on affordable, reliable energy, and at no time is it more important than now to have access to that affordability, Mr Speaker. And that's why we're supporting community groups and businesses through our energy efficiency program, Mr Speaker, that allows them to invest in equipment and upgrades to reduce their energy bills and bring down emissions at the same time, Mr Speaker, and that includes businesses like Espresso Bonsai Cafe in Surfers Paradise, businesses like Nobby Beach Holiday Village, Mr Speaker, businesses that were seriously impacted by what happened to tourism on the Gold Coast, Mr Speaker, from COVID-19. Now, all of this builds on action that we've taken to keep energy companies accountable through the Big Stick legislation, Mr Speaker, through the Big Stick legislation. The ban we put on sneaky late payment fees, Mr Speaker, and the introduction of price caps for families and small businesses, Mr Speaker, and report after report is telling us that our plan is working. Our plan is working. 8 consecutive quarters of year-on-year CPI price reductions in electricity, Mr Speaker, 8 consecutive quarters, and hundreds of thousands of families and businesses across Australia have benefited from the default market offer, the price caps we've put in place, and that includes, for instance, a family in Highland Park could be up to $794 a year better off as a result of those price caps. A cafe in Surfers Paradise, $6,200 a year better off, Mr Speaker, and a bakery in Broadbeach Waters, $4,400 a year better off as a result of that reform, Mr Speaker. But there's better deals than that available, as the member for Moncrieff knows. All you have to do is go onto the Energy Made Easy website, Mr Speaker, and you can compare offers and get the best possible plan based on your historical usage. I know the Spar supermarket has been shopping around and it found significant savings on Chevron Island, Mr Speaker. This is all about delivering Australians the affordable, reliable energy they deserve at a critical time when we need them to be as competitive as possible, Mr Speaker, bringing down their energy bills as we bring down emissions.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the reported sexual assault of Brittany Higgins. This morning, in response to a Senate order, the government has confirmed the review by the Prime Minister's former Chief of Staff into what his office knew is a cabinet process. Why is the Prime Minister continuing his cover-up using cabinet in confidence? Don't the Parliament, the public and most of all Brittany Higgins deserve the truth?
The Prime Minister has the call.
I've already told the Parliament in response to similar questions, Mr Speaker, that I am awaiting the report from the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He also used to be the Secretary of Treasury. He also used to be the Secretary of Treasury in the New South Wales government, Mr. Speaker. And he used to be my Chief of Staff. That is true, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I've said that once I receive that report, I will report further. I will report further. I advised the House yesterday, Mr. Speaker, the issues that the Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, Mr. Speaker, if there are issues regarding sensitivity matters that the Federal Police have advised him of, Mr. Speaker, I'll wait for him to give me that advice. But the assertions that are put forward by the member for Sydney, Mr. Speaker, and the assertions and allegations that are made in those questions, Mr. Speaker, I don't accept.
The Leader of the Opposition seeking to table the document.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I seek leave to table the document from Senator the Hon Simon Birmingham, which goes to the issue of somehow this Gaget's report being a matter for the Cabinet rather than for public.
Is leave granted? Leave is granted.
Good.
The member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure, Cities and the Arts. Will the Minister please update the House on the Morrison government's world-leading work to keep Australians safe online, especially with so many of us working and learning from home during the COVID-19 pandemic?
The Minister for Communications, Urban Infrastructure and the Arts.
Well, I do thank the member for Reid for her question. Of course, with her experience as a clinical psychologist before coming into the parliament, she is very well informed about the importance of mental health and, of course, the impacts of access to the internet and some of the dangers that need to be guarded against. And, Mr. Speaker, this has been a big week for the principle that the internet platforms need to comply with the rule of law if they're doing business in Australia. And I want to congratulate the Prime Minister and the Treasurer for their leadership as we've passed the News Media Bargaining Code into law. But of course, we are working across the full range of areas where it is important to make sure that the rule of law applies in relation to all of the things that we do online, with the internet being a pervasive part of modern life. And keeping Australians safe online has been a focus for this government since we came in 2013. We established the world's first Children's E-Safety Commissioner to support Australian children experiencing cyberbullying. We expanded the remit of that office to include all Australians and introduced a scheme to support the victims of image-based abuse, an absolute scourge. And in 2019, we responded to the abhorrent Christchurch mosque attacks by adding the abhorrent violent material legislative measures to the powers of the E-Safety Commissioner. And we are going further, Mr. Speaker, just this week, introducing into the parliament a bill to establish a new Online Safety Act, which will establish a new scheme to deal with serious cyber abuse of Australian adults. We're building on the success of our scheme to deal with cyberbullying against children, of course a higher threshold, recognising that our adults are more resilient and we need to properly balance freedom of speech issues. But for the first time, there will be the capacity to go to the E-Safety Commissioner if you've been the victim of vicious, abhorrent abuse online, and she will have the power to determine whether that meets the statutory standard, and if so, to issue a takedown notice, and the platforms will be required to comply. We're expanding the cyberbullying scheme so we go beyond social media platforms to, for example, chat services as part of games. We're going to have a basic online safety expectations. And of course, the E-Safety Commissioner will have new powers to go to the platforms, to internet service providers and others and say, give us information about the identity of the person who has posted this abhorrent material, and civil penalties can be levied against that person. So, Mr. Speaker, we're determined to keep Australians safe online. The principle we are committed to is that the rule of law must apply in the digital town square as well as in the physical town square.
The member for Sydney. The Prime Minister.
Speaker, I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper.